A wealthy man mocked a waitress at an expensive restaurant, thinking she was beneath him. What he discovered about her life changed everything. The hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses filled the air of La Belle Maison, the pinnacle of fine dining in Manhattan. The restaurant was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Polished marble floors reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers, and the soft murmur of refined voices mingled with the distant notes of a live pianist. Every detail, from the leather-bound menus to the delicate floral centerpieces, was curated to exude exclusivity. Ethan Bradford sat at a prime corner table, the view of the bustling dining room giving him a perfect vantage point to see and be seen. His tailored navy suit fit like a second skin, accentuating his broad shoulders and lean frame. On his wrist, a platinum Rolex shimmered under the dim, golden light. He leaned back, one arm draped casually over the chair, exuding an air of effortless superiority. "Another round of Margot," Ethan said. His tone clipped as he waved a sommelier over. His voice carried across the table, commanding rather than requesting. He didn't even glance at the young man who hurried off to fulfill his order. Around the table sat 3 other men, all equally polished and self-assured. They were his usual company, colleagues and rivals in finance, each eager to outdo the other in stories of opulence. Tonight's topic revolved around yachts, a recent auction at Sotheby's, and the merits of private islands over estates in the Hamptons. Laughter punctuated their conversation, sharp and self-congratulatory. "I told her the villa in St. Tropez wouldn't sell for less than 9 figures. One of them boasted, raising his glass. "And guess what? Closed at 101 million. Ethan smirked, raising his own glass. "Amateurs," he quipped. "Real money isn't in property, it's in people. You leverage the right partnerships and you're printing cash." His companions nodded in agreement, their laughter ringing with the unspoken acknowledgement that Ethan was, indeed, the sharpest among them. It was then that she arrived at their table. Sophia moved with an efficiency that was almost unnoticeable. Her steps were light, her movements precise, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. She wore the restaurant's standard uniform, a crisp white blouse and tailored black slacks. There was no ostentation in her appearance, yet something about her presence drew attention. Perhaps it was her posture, straight and confident, or the way her dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her tone polite yet cool. "Have you decided on dessert, or should I bring the menu again?" Ethan looked up, his sharp blue eyes scanning her from head to toe. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if surprised by her directness. Then, a slow smirk spread across his face. "I'm surprised they let you work here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Not exactly the polished look La Belle Maison advertises. Sophia didn't flinch. Her expression remained neutral, though her eyes held a flicker of something Ethan couldn't quite place. Amusement? Contempt? Either way, she didn't seem intimidated. "We strive to offer excellent service, sir," she replied evenly. "Not just appearances." The table erupted in awkward chuckles. One of Ethan's companions cleared his throat, clearly uneasy with the exchange. But Ethan leaned back in his chair, undeterred. "Service is great and all," he continued, gesturing vaguely with his hand. "But presentation matters, don't you think? A place like this should reflect refinement." Sophia stood still, her tray balanced in one hand, her free arm resting lightly at her side. For a moment, she seemed to consider responding, but then her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a smile so subtle it could have been imagined. "Noted," she said finally, her voice calm as a winter morning. "Will there be anything else?" Ethan's smirk deepened. "No, sweetheart," he said, the term gratingly familiar. "Just don't forget the check." Sophia inclined her head slightly and walked away, her movements as fluid as they had been when she arrived. Ethan watched her go, the smirk still playing on his lips. Around the table, his companions murmured uneasily, but the conversation quickly shifted back to yachts and auction houses. Yet, as the evening wore on, Ethan found his attention drifting back to the interaction. There was something about her. The way she didn't react, didn't shrink beneath his words. It was unusual. Most people, especially those in her position, would have faltered or at least tried to appease him. Instead, she had remained calm, composed, and utterly unshaken. As the evening wound down, Ethan and his group rose from their table, making their way toward the exit. The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, the doorman already hailing a sleek black limousine for their party. But before Ethan could step into the car, he caught sight of Sophia again. She stood near the restaurant entrance, speaking with an older man in a tailored suit. The man gestured animatedly, but Sophia's expression remained composed, her posture as steady as it had been during their encounter. There was no deference in her body language, no hint of subservience. Ethan paused, his hand resting on the open car door. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the interaction piqued his curiosity. The man, clearly someone of importance, seemed almost deferential to her. It didn't make sense. "Coming, Ethan?" one of his friends called, already sliding into the limousine. Yeah, Ethan muttered, brushing off the moment. He climbed into the car, the leather seats cool against his palms, but his mind lingered on the scene he'd just witnessed. Who was Sophia, really? And why did she seem so unfazed? As the limousine pulled away from the curb, Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring out at the glittering cityscape. He was used to being the one who held all the cards, the one who saw through people and situations. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt an unfamiliar itch, an unsettling mix of irritation and intrigue. She was just a waitress, he told himself, dismissing the thought as quickly as it came. Nothing more. And yet, as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated her. What would you do if you were in Sophia's shoes, facing Ethan's arrogance? Share your thoughts in the comments, and while you're here, don't forget to give this story a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more intriguing twists ahead. The morning sunlight filtered through the expansive windows of La Belle Maison as the staff prepared for another day of catering to Manhattan's elite. Sophia Richards moved through the polished floors of the restaurant with quiet efficiency. Her steps were measured, her posture upright, and her expression calm. The clatter of silverware being polished, the murmur of the chef giving instructions, and the distant hum of classical music created a rhythm that Sophia had come to know well. Unlike most of her colleagues, Sophia carried herself with an air of detachment, though not coldness. She was cordial and professional, but she rarely engaged in small talk or shared much about herself. To most of the staff, she was a mystery, a hard worker who showed up on time, completed her tasks with precision, and disappeared as soon as her shift ended. Yet there was one thing everyone agreed upon. Sophia was different. After the encounter with Ethan Bradford the previous evening, Sophia had felt no lingering frustration or resentment. She had grown accustomed to men like him, entitled, arrogant, and convinced that the world bent to their whims. She had seen them countless times, flaunting their wealth, dismissing the efforts of those who made their lives comfortable, and always assuming their opinions mattered more than anyone else's. But Sophia had long since learned not to let their words pierce her armor. Instead, she saw such moments as opportunities, small windows into the minds of people who believed themselves untouchable. And if there was one thing Sophia had learned in her journey, it was that no one was truly untouchable. As she placed fresh linens on the tables, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out discreetly, glancing at the message on the screen. It was from her business partner, Ryan. "Call me when you have a moment. We need to finalize the London deal." Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile before she slid the phone back into her pocket. Ryan could wait a few hours. For now, she was Sophia Richards, waitress at La Belle Maison, not the CEO of one of the most exclusive restaurant chains in the world. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Bradford couldn't get Sophia out of his head. He paced the polished floors of his penthouse, his phone in hand as he scrolled aimlessly through emails. It wasn't like him to dwell on something, or someone, for this long. Usually, he dismissed interactions with waitstaff as easily as he forgot the names of restaurants he dined in. "Why does this bother me so much?" he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He glanced at his reflection in the full-length mirror, the city skyline a glittering backdrop behind him. He was Ethan Bradford, for God's sake, master of the universe, or at least his carefully curated corner of it. And yet, her calm demeanor, her refusal to be flustered or impressed, had struck a nerve. By early afternoon, Sophia was walking briskly through a park near the restaurant. Her break was brief, but she relished the moments of fresh air and solitude. As she sat on a bench overlooking the fountain, she pulled out her phone and dialed Ryan's number. Finally, Ryan's voice came through, laced with mock impatience. "You're harder to reach than the Prime Minister." "Good to hear from you too, Ryan," Sophia replied, her tone light. "What's the update?" "The London property is almost secured, but we need your final approval on the design specs." "And," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "you're sure about this undercover thing?" "It's not too late to reconsider." Sophia chuckled softly. "You worry too much. This is exactly what I need to do. I'm learning more here than I ever could sitting behind a desk." Ryan sighed. "Just remember, not everyone would understand your methods." "They don't need to," Sophia said firmly. "I'm not doing this for their approval." Back at La Belle Maison, the dinner rush was beginning. As Sophia returned to the restaurant, she immediately fell into her role, weaving through tables and attending to patrons with practiced ease. Her colleagues often marveled at her ability to maintain composure in even the most chaotic situations. That evening, Sophia found herself at Ethan's table once more. He was seated with a smaller group this time, but his presence was no less commanding. He leaned back in his chair, speaking animatedly about a recent acquisition that had left his competitors scrambling. His confidence was palpable, his laughter sharp and unrestrained. When Sophia approached to take their order, Ethan's gaze flicked to her, and for a brief moment, there was a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Back again, I see," he said, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of challenge. "Do you work every night, or are we just lucky?" Sophia didn't miss a beat. "Hard work is the foundation of success," she replied, her voice steady. "Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Bradford?" Ethan's companions chuckled, but Ethan himself tilted his head, studying her. "A philosopher waitress. That's new." Sophia smiled faintly, offering no further comment as she jotted down their orders. As she walked away, she could feel his gaze lingering on her, but she refused to turn around. By the time the evening wound down, Ethan's irritation had morphed into fascination. He watched as Sophia moved through the room, her every gesture precise, her every word measured. She wasn't just a waitress. There was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Who is she? He found himself wondering aloud as he sipped the last of his wine. His companion raised an eyebrow. "Who? The waitress?" the man asked, glancing over his shoulder. "She's just doing her job, Ethan." Ethan frowned but said nothing. It was unlike him to obsess over someone so ordinary. But Sophia Richards was anything but ordinary, and deep down, Ethan knew it. As Sophia locked up that night, she paused to glance at her reflection in the darkened windows of the restaurant. Her uniform was neat, her hair still perfectly in place. But beneath the polished exterior was a woman with a plan. A woman who knew exactly what she was doing. For Sophia, this was more than just a job. It was an opportunity, a carefully calculated step in a larger game. And while Ethan Bradford might not realize it yet, he was about to become a key piece on her board. The following week, Manhattan hummed with its usual rhythm. Taxicabs honking, crowds bustling along sidewalks, and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts drifting from street vendors. For most, it was just another Tuesday, but for Ethan Bradford, the day carried a strange undercurrent of anticipation. His curiosity about Sophia Richards hadn't waned. In fact, it had only grown sharper. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself as he adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror. "She's just a waitress." And yet, when his business lunch plans shifted to dinner at La Belle Maison, he didn't protest. A part of him, the part he refused to name, was eager to see her again. That evening, Ethan arrived with two colleagues, their tailored suits matching the elegance of the restaurant's interior. The maitre d' greeted him with the same deference reserved for the elite, escorting them to a prime table near the grand piano. Ethan scanned the room instinctively, his sharp eyes flitting over the waitstaff. There she was, Sophia, moving gracefully between tables, Her tray balanced effortlessly as she engaged in brief conversations with patrons. She wore the same understated uniform, yet there was an undeniable confidence in the way she carried herself, as if the bustling restaurant operated under her silent command. Ethan felt an uncharacteristic twinge of nervousness. What was it about her that unsettled him? He quickly brushed the thought aside as Sophia approached their table. "Good evening, gentlemen," she began, her tone polite but devoid of warmth. "May I start you off with drinks?" Ethan couldn't resist the opportunity to prod her. "Ah, Miss Richards," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Still gracing us with your presence, I see. No dreams of a bigger stage?" Sophia's eyes flicked to his, her expression unreadable. "Every stage has its purpose, Mr. Bradford," she replied, her voice steady. "Shall I bring the wine list?" The response was calm, almost dismissive, and it irked Ethan more than he cared to admit. "I'll have the Chateau Margaux," he said curtly, "and do make sure it's chilled this time." Sophia nodded, making a note without another word. Her poise irritated him, though he couldn't say why. As she walked away, one of his colleagues chuckled softly. "Someone's not falling for your charm," the man said, amused. Ethan shrugged, feigning indifference. "She's just another waitress," he replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Later that evening, the restaurant was alive with energy. The pianist played a soft melody, and the gentle clink of silverware blended with the low hum of conversation. Sophia moved between tables, her efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos around her. She was the eye of the storm, unshaken and composed. When she returned to Ethan's table to take their orders, the tension between them was palpable. "I trust everything is satisfactory so far?" she asked, her tone neutral. Ethan leaned forward slightly, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "That depends," he said. "Do you always treat your patrons with such indifference, or am I just special?" Sophia met his gaze evenly. "Respect and indifference are not the same thing, Mr. Bradford," she said. "I aim to provide the former." His colleagues stifled their laughter, but Ethan didn't seem fazed. If anything, her response intrigued him further. "Touché," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "You're full of surprises." Sophia didn't respond, instead turning her attention to the rest of the table. As she moved on, Ethan found himself watching her again, the same questions swirling in his mind. Who was she, really? And why did she seem so unfazed? The night wore on, and Ethan's fascination only deepened. After the meal, his colleagues left, but Ethan lingered, ordering another glass of wine. The restaurant was quieter now, the dinner rush fading into a lull. He spotted Sophia near the bar, speaking with one of the bartenders. Her posture was relaxed, yet there was a subtle authority in the way she gestured, as if she were more than just an employee. Unable to resist, Ethan approached her. "Enjoying the quiet?" he asked, his tone casual. Sophia turned to him, her expression calm but wary. "Is there something I can assist you with, Mr. Bradford?" "Just curious," he said, leaning against the bar. "You don't strike me as the type to blend into the background." Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself." Ethan studied her for a moment, his curiosity mounting. "You're not like the others," he said finally. "There's something different about you." Sophia's expression didn't falter. "If you'll excuse me," she said, stepping away, "I have work to attend to." Ethan watched her leave, a mix of frustration and intrigue bubbling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt out of his depth. Sophia Richards was a puzzle, and Ethan Bradford was determined to solve it. By the time Ethan left the restaurant, the city lights were twinkling against the dark sky. He climbed into the back seat of his limousine, his thoughts consumed by the enigma that was Sophia. "She's just a waitress," he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow. Deep down, he knew there was more to her story, something she wasn't revealing. As the car sped through the streets of Manhattan, Ethan felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar. The realization that, for all his wealth and power, there were still things he didn't understand, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Back at La Belle Maison, Sophia finished her shift in silence. As the last patrons trickled out and the staff began cleaning up, she retreated to the back office. She closed the door behind her, sinking into the chair as she pulled out her phone. A single message awaited her from Ryan. "Everything's in place. Let me know when you're ready to move forward." Sophia stared at the screen for a moment before typing her reply. "Not yet. There's still more to learn." She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Ethan Bradford was proving to be an interesting study, but she wasn't ready to make her next move. Not yet. For now, she would remain in the shadows, quietly observing, silently planning. Because in the end, Sophia Richards always played the long game. The next evening, Manhattan was cloaked in a soft drizzle, the streets shimmering under the glow of streetlights. Ethan Bradford, however, barely noticed the weather as he exited his office. His thoughts were consumed by Sophia Richards. Over the past week, her composed demeanor and cryptic presence had gnawed at his mind, challenging his belief that he understood people at a glance. "She's just a waitress," he repeated under his breath, though the words felt more like a mantra than a conviction. Something about her calm defiance intrigued him, and not in a way he was used to. He wasn't seeking her approval or attention, but rather an answer to the unspoken question. Who is Sophia Richards? The following day, Ethan decided to return to La Belle Maison, this time under the guise of meeting a prospective client. Arriving just after lunch, he requested a private table near the back, where the clamor of the main dining room was muted. He scanned the room casually, and there she was, moving between tables with her usual efficiency. Her hair was tied back, her uniform immaculate, and her expression carried the same composed professionalism that had so unnerved him. Ethan feigned indifference, though his heart beat faster when Sophia approached. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice even. "Have you decided on an order, or shall I bring the menu?" Ethan looked up at her, a slow smile playing on his lips. "I trust your recommendations. What's the best thing here?" Sophia raised an eyebrow, and for a fleeting moment, something akin to amusement flickered in her eyes. "The seared scallops are popular," she said, "though I assume you'd prefer the margot to pair with it?" Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You remember." "I have a good memory," Sophia replied, jotting down his order. "Is there anything else?" For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He wanted to ask more, to pry into her life, but her composed demeanor made it clear she wouldn't indulge him easily. "That'll do for now," he said finally. As she walked away, Ethan couldn't help but notice the way other staff seemed to defer to her. A new waitress approached her nervously, seeking guidance, and Sophia responded with a calm authority that belied her supposed position as a server. Ethan's curiosity deepened when his client, a seasoned restaurateur, joined him at the table. The man, Charles Fontaine, had built his reputation on running exclusive dining establishments across Europe. "You've picked a good spot," Charles remarked, glancing around the restaurant. La Belle Maison has a reputation for impeccable service and consistency. Not easy to maintain in this city. Ethan smiled faintly. "And what about the staff? Do you think they're up to par?" Charles shrugged, taking a sip of his wine. "Depends on who you're asking about. The team's solid, but the real backbone here is Sophia Richards." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, though he kept his expression neutral. "Sophia? The waitress?" Charles chuckled. "She's not just a waitress. That woman is sharper than most executives I've worked with. Rumor has it she's connected to the chain's management, maybe even higher. She's the kind of person who could run a place like this blindfolded." Ethan felt a jolt of disbelief. Connected to management? The thought seemed absurd, yet the pieces began to fall into place. Her unshaken confidence, the way other staff sought her guidance, and her uncanny ability to command a room without saying much. "Interesting," Ethan said, swirling his wine. "She doesn't exactly advertise that." "She wouldn't," Charles replied. "That's her strength. She observes, learns, and stays in the background until she needs to step forward. If I were you, I'd tread carefully." Ethan nodded absently, though his mind raced. He wasn't sure whether to feel intrigued or insulted. Was she hiding something from him deliberately? Or had he simply failed to see what was in front of him? That evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse, determined to learn more about Sophia. He sat at his sleek glass desk, the city lights glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched her name online, but the results were surprisingly sparse. No social media profiles, no LinkedIn, no articles or mentions in business publications. It was as if she didn't exist outside the walls of La Belle Maison. Frustration bubbled inside him. How could someone so composed, so obviously capable, leave no trace behind? Finally, he resorted to calling his private investigator, Daniel Shore. "I need you to dig into someone for me," Ethan said, his tone clipped. "Of course," Daniel replied smoothly. "Name? Sophia Richards. Works as a waitress at La Belle Maison." There was a brief pause. "A waitress? That doesn't sound like your usual concern." "She's an anomaly," Ethan admitted reluctantly. "And I don't like anomalies." Daniel chuckled softly. "Understood. I'll have something for you within 48 hours. Meanwhile, Sophia sat in her modest apartment, reviewing business reports from her team. The acquisition in London was progressing smoothly, and her plans for the expansion into Tokyo were ahead of schedule. Yet, as she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifted to Ethan Bradford. She had noticed his growing interest, the way his questions had shifted from idle banter to genuine curiosity. He wasn't used to people like her, people who didn't fit neatly into his expectations, and that made him both dangerous and predictable. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Ryan. "Bradford's digging. Want me to intervene?" Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile. "No need. Let him dig. He won't find anything I don't want him to." She set the phone aside and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. The game was beginning to take shape, and Sophia was always 3 moves ahead. 2 days later, Ethan received a call from Daniel. The investigator's tone was unusually cautious. "I've looked into Sophia Richards," Daniel began, "but there's not much to find. No records prior to 5 years ago. No family, no public presence, nothing." Ethan frowned. "That's impossible. Everyone leaves a trail." "Not her," Daniel said. "Whoever she is, she's either exceptionally private or exceptionally connected. If I had to guess, she's hiding in plain sight." Ethan's frustration mounted. "Keep digging," he snapped, ending the call. For the first time in years, Ethan Bradford felt outmaneuvered. Sophia Richards wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just confident. She was deliberate. And if there was one thing Ethan couldn't stand, it was being blindsided. Ethan Bradford was not a man accustomed to frustration. For years, his wealth and influence had carved a path of success so seamless that obstacles felt like an abstract concept. But Sophia Richards, this woman who should have been inconsequential in his world, was proving to be an exception. She occupied his thoughts in a way that unsettled him, challenging his confidence and control. And now, as he sat in his penthouse staring at the skyline, the question gnawed at him. Who was she? His phone buzzed on the glass table beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Daniel Shore, his investigator. "Got something for me?" Ethan asked, his voice clipped. "Not much," Daniel admitted, "but enough to confirm one thing. She's no ordinary waitress." Ethan straightened in his chair. "What do you mean?" "There's a connection between her and the ownership of La Belle Maison," Daniel said. "The name Sophia Richards doesn't appear anywhere in the official paperwork, but her movements and influence suggest she's tied to the chain, possibly as a silent partner, or even something bigger." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Why the secrecy? That's the real question, isn't it?" Daniel replied. "Whatever her reason, she's playing her cards close to the chest. And judging by what I've seen, she's very good at it." Ethan ended the call, his jaw clenched. Sophia Richards wasn't just an enigma. She was a challenge. And Ethan Bradford never backed down from a challenge. The following evening, Ethan arrived at La Belle Maison unannounced, his presence drawing the usual attention. The maitre d' greeted him warmly, but Ethan barely acknowledged the man, his eyes scanning the room for Sophia. She wasn't on the floor. "Is Ms. Richards here tonight?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. The maitre d' hesitated, clearly surprised by the question. "I believe she's in the back office, Mr. Bradford. Shall I?" "No need," Ethan said, brushing past him. His stride was purposeful as he made his way to the rear of the restaurant, where the staff offices were tucked away. He wasn't entirely sure what he planned to say, but he was determined to confront her. He found her seated at a desk, reviewing a stack of papers. The room was modest compared to the opulence of the restaurant, but Sophia's presence made it seem like a command center. Her hair was pinned neatly back, and her expression was one of quiet focus. She looked up as he entered, her calm demeanor unbroken. "Mr. Bradford," she said, setting down her pen, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan closed the door behind him, leaning casually against the frame. "You've been keeping secrets, Ms. Richards." Sophia arched an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Have I?" "Don't play coy," he said, his tone sharpening. "I know you're not just a waitress." Sophia leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "And what makes you think that?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Let's start with the way your staff defers to you, or the fact that you handle crises like you're running the place. Then there's the matter of your name. No digital footprint, no past, nothing. People like you don't just appear out of nowhere." Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile. "People like me? You know what I mean," Ethan said. "You've been hiding in plain sight, but I'm not sure why." Sophia studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. Then she stood, her movements deliberate. "And if I am?" she asked, her voice calm. "What difference does it make to you?" Ethan was taken aback by her directness. "Because I don't like being deceived." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her expression softening into something almost amused. "Deceived? Or outmaneuvered?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. For all his bravado, Ethan knew she was right. He wasn't used to people like her, people who didn't bend to his will, who challenged his assumptions without fear. And that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The confrontation lingered in Ethan's mind long after he left the restaurant. He replayed their exchange, dissecting every word and gesture. Sophia had evaded his questions with a skill that bordered on artistry, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that she had revealed something in the process, something unspoken but undeniable. The next day, Ethan threw himself into his work, hoping to distract himself from the growing obsession. But even in the midst of high-stakes meetings and multimillion-dollar deals, his thoughts drifted to her. He had spent years mastering the art of reading people, but Sophia Richards remained a mystery he couldn't unravel. Meanwhile, Sophia carried on with her routine at La Belle Maison, though she was acutely aware of Ethan's growing interest. His questions, his persistence, it was all predictable. Men like him thrived on control, and she had deliberately withheld it. But what he didn't know was that she had no intention of letting him dictate the terms of their interaction. As she prepared for another evening shift, her phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. "He's getting closer. You sure you're ready for this?" Sophia's reply was immediate. "I've been ready for years. Let him come." She slipped the phone into her pocket, her mind focused and unshaken. This wasn't just about Ethan Bradford's curiosity or his bruised ego. It was about something far bigger, something she had been planning long before he ever walked into her restaurant. That evening, Ethan returned once more, this time under the guise of a casual dinner. He dined alone, his gaze occasionally drifting to where Sophia worked. She moved with her usual poise, her expression calm and collected. But Ethan was no longer content to observe from a distance. As she passed his table, he stopped her. "Join me for a drink," he said, his tone less commanding than usual. Sophia hesitated, her expression thoughtful. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. Just for a moment, she slid into the chair opposite him, her posture as composed as ever. Ethan poured a glass of wine for her, but she didn't touch it. "You've been making quite an impression," he said, breaking the silence. "I'm just doing my job," Sophia replied. "Is that all it is?" Ethan asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because you don't strike me as someone content to stay in the background." Sophia's eyes met his, and for the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of something. Amusement, perhaps, or challenge. Sometimes, the background is where you learn the most. The response intrigued him, though it offered no real answers. "You're full of surprises, Ms. Richards." Sophia smiled faintly. "And you're full of assumptions, Mr. Bradford." Their eyes locked, the tension between them palpable. In that moment, Ethan realized something. Whatever game they were playing, Sophia was playing to win. The air inside La Belle Maison was heavier than usual that evening, though it had nothing to do with the weather or the number of patrons filling its elegant halls. For Ethan Bradford, the tension had become nearly unbearable. He wasn't sure when his fascination with Sophia Richards had turned into an obsession, but by now, she occupied his thoughts more than his multimillion-dollar deals or the high-powered meetings that usually consumed his days. Sophia, however, remained an enigma. Her movements, her composure, even her occasional, calculated words seemed to be part of a carefully constructed puzzle Ethan couldn't solve. And he hated puzzles. It was during a prestigious industry gala that things took an unexpected turn. Ethan hadn't planned to attend, but when he received word that La Belle Maison's management team would be present, curiosity drew him in. Dressed in a custom black tuxedo, he entered the grand ballroom with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was one of the wealthiest men in the room. The event was a showcase of culinary excellence, with top chefs and restaurateurs mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Ethan scanned the room, his sharp eyes searching for a familiar face. And then he saw her. Sophia stood near the stage, her dark hair cascading over one shoulder, her elegant black dress a stark departure from the reserved uniforms he was used to seeing her wear. She wasn't working tonight. She was commanding the room. She spoke with a small group of industry leaders, her posture poised, her tone measured. People listened when she talked, their expressions respectful, almost deferential. Ethan froze. This wasn't the Sophia he thought he knew. Quite the presence, isn't she? A voice beside him said, pulling him from his thoughts. Ethan turned to see Charles Fontaine, the restaurateur he had dined with earlier. The older man smirked, raising his glass of champagne. Sophia Richards. Now you see why I told you to tread carefully. Ethan's brows furrowed. What's her connection to all this? Charles chuckled. You don't know? He took a sip of his drink, clearly enjoying Ethan's discomfort. She owns the chain, Bradford, La Belle Maison, Maison Tokyo, Maison Paris, the whole thing. She's the CEO. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. The words didn't make sense. She's what? You heard me, Charles said. She's been running this empire for years, quietly expanding it into one of the most exclusive chains in the world. Doesn't advertise it, though. Likes to keep a low profile. Ethan's mind raced. Sophia Richards wasn't just an ambitious woman with a strong work ethic. She was a powerhouse. Someone who had built a global empire without the fanfare he was so accustomed to. And she had been right under his nose this whole time. Later that evening, Ethan waited for his chance to confront her. The gala was winding down, and Sophia had stepped out onto the balcony, away from the noise and chatter. She leaned against the railing, her expression serene as she looked out over the city. Ethan approached, his steps measured, but his heart was pounding. Sophia. She turned slowly, her face calm but unreadable. Mr. Bradford. He came to stand beside her, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat of his frustration. You've been hiding something. Sophia tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. Have I? Don't play games, Ethan said, his voice firm. I know who you are now. CEO of La Belle Maison. Owner of this entire chain. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. And you let me believe you were just a waitress, Ethan snapped. Why? Sophia let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. Because that's what you wanted to believe, Mr. Bradford. You looked at me and saw what you wanted to see. Someone beneath you, someone unimportant. Her words hit harder than Ethan cared to admit. He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued. You make assumptions, Ethan. About people, about power, about worth. You think it's all tied to appearances, to status. But you never stop to look deeper. Ethan frowned, her words cutting through his carefully constructed facade. Is that what this has been? A game to prove a point? Sophia shook her head. No, Ethan. This isn't a game. This is who I am. I've worked for everything I have, and I've learned that people like you only see what you want to see. I didn't deceive you. You deceived yourself. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself speechless. He had built his career on understanding people, on outmaneuvering them, yet here was someone who had played him without even trying. It wasn't just humbling, it was infuriating. "I don't like being outmaneuvered," he said finally, his voice low. Sophia's smile returned, but this time, there was a hint of warmth in it. "Then maybe it's time you learned to stop underestimating people." The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows. Ethan replayed the conversation in his mind, every word she had said cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, to being the one caught off guard. And yet, as unsettling as it was, he couldn't deny the spark of respect that had ignited within him. Sophia Richards wasn't just another name on a list of people to outmaneuver. She was something entirely different, a force he hadn't anticipated. And for the first time in years, Ethan Bradford felt like he was playing catch-up. Sophia, meanwhile, returned home that night with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The look on Ethan's face during their conversation had been telling. He wasn't just frustrated. He was rethinking everything he thought he knew about her, about himself. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. "How'd it go?" Sophia smiled faintly as she typed her reply. "Exactly as planned." She set the phone down and turned off the light, her mind already on the next move. Ethan Bradford was learning, slowly, but surely. And in the end, that was exactly what she wanted. Ethan Bradford was a man accustomed to unraveling mysteries, but the enigma that was Sophia Richards continued to elude him. The revelation of her true identity had sent him reeling, but it had also lit a fire in him, a need to understand the woman who had managed to challenge everything he thought he knew. He wasn't sure what he wanted more, to prove he could outmaneuver her or to understand the depth of her calculated brilliance. Perhaps it was both. The next few weeks were marked by subtle shifts in their interactions. Ethan returned to La Belle Maison several times under the guise of business, though his true motive was always Sophia. She remained professional, her demeanor calm but distant, never offering more than what was required of her role as a hostess, or CEO, as he now knew. Each encounter left Ethan feeling more intrigued and less certain of his own footing. One evening, as the restaurant buzzed with the chatter of its elite clientele, Sophia approached Ethan's table with her usual grace. "Good evening, Mr. Bradford," she said, her voice neutral. "I see you've become a regular." Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Can you blame me? The service here is impeccable." Sophia's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I'm glad to hear it. Will you be dining alone tonight?" "For now," Ethan replied, his tone suggestive. "Unless you'd care to join me." Sophia arched an eyebrow, her composure unbroken. "I'm afraid my schedule doesn't allow for such luxuries." Ethan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You're full of surprises, Ms. Richards. And I can't help but feel there's more to your story." Sophia's eyes met his, and for a moment, something flickered in her gaze. Amusement, perhaps, or a challenge. "Everyone has a story, Mr. Bradford. The question is, how much of it are they willing to share?" Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. Later that week, Ethan decided to take a more direct approach. He arranged a private meeting with Charles Fontaine, hoping to glean more about Sophia's rise to power. The older man welcomed Ethan into his office, a luxurious space lined with shelves of fine wines and framed accolades. "So," Charles began, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "What brings you here, Bradford? I assume it's not just to talk business." Ethan accepted the glass, his expression thoughtful. "It's Sophia Richards." Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "I should have known. She tends to have that effect on people." "What's her story?" Ethan asked, his tone serious. "How did she build all this?" Charles leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink. "Sophia's story isn't mine to tell, but I'll say this. She didn't inherit her success, if that's what you're thinking. She built it from the ground up, one restaurant at a time. She's smart, ruthless when she needs to be, and she's not afraid to get her hands dirty." Ethan frowned. "Ruthless? Don't mistake her calm demeanor for weakness," Charles said. "Sophia's a strategist. She knows how to play the long game, and she always comes out ahead. If you're trying to outmaneuver her, "You're in for a challenge." The words lingered in Ethan's mind as he left the meeting. He wasn't used to being warned about someone, especially not in such reverent terms. It only made him more determined to understand the woman who had captivated his thoughts. Sophia, meanwhile, was aware of Ethan's growing curiosity. She had anticipated his persistence, but what surprised her was his shift in demeanor. He seemed less arrogant now, more thoughtful, as if he were genuinely trying to understand her instead of simply challenging her. One evening, as she reviewed reports in her office, her phone buzzed with a message. "Dinner. My treat. You choose the place." Sophia stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to respond. It wasn't like Ethan to approach her so directly, and she wondered what his true motive was. Finally, she typed a reply. "Fine. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Le Petit Café." It was a modest choice, far removed from the luxury of La Belle Maison, but Sophia preferred it that way. If Ethan wanted answers, he'd have to meet her on her terms. The following evening, Ethan arrived at the cafe, his tailored suit slightly out of place in the cozy, unassuming setting. The scent of fresh bread and brewed coffee filled the air as he spotted Sophia at a corner table, her posture as composed as ever. "Interesting choice," he said as he approached. "I thought a change of pace might do you some good," Sophia replied, gesturing for him to sit. Ethan took the seat across from her, studying her carefully. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, her makeup minimal, yet she carried herself with the same quiet confidence that always drew his attention. "Why the secrecy?" he asked after a moment. "You could have built your brand on your name, your face. Why stay in the shadows?" Sophia leaned back, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Because power is most effective when it's not flaunted. Let people underestimate you, and you'll always have the upper hand." Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. "And that's what you did with me. Let me believe you were just another server." Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile. "You believed what you wanted to believe. I didn't correct you because it wasn't necessary." Her words stung, though Ethan couldn't deny their truth. "And now?" he pressed. "Why let me see behind the curtain?" Sophia's expression softened, though her eyes remained guarded. "Because I think you're starting to understand something you didn't before. About people. About yourself." Ethan frowned. "And what's that?" "That power isn't about control," Sophia said simply. "It's about influence. And influence comes from understanding people, not dominating them." For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of her words sink in. He had spent his life wielding power like a weapon, but Sophia's approach was different, calculated, subtle, and infinitely more effective. As the night wore on, their conversation shifted from strategy to personal stories. Sophia shared glimpses of her journey, how she had started with a single failing restaurant and transformed it into an empire. Ethan, in turn, spoke of his rise in finance, though he found himself glossing over the more ruthless aspects of his success. By the time they parted ways, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected: admiration. Sophia Richards wasn't just a challenge. She was someone he respected, perhaps even someone he wanted to learn from. As he watched her disappear into the night, Ethan realized the game had changed. This wasn't just about outmaneuvering her anymore. It was about proving that he could rise to her level. The days that followed their dinner at Le Petit Café marked a subtle but undeniable shift in the dynamic between Ethan Bradford and Sophia Richards. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't strategizing on how to gain the upper hand. Instead, he found himself reflecting on Sophia's words, her methods, and the choices that had shaped her path. It was disconcerting to realize that she wasn't just an opponent to outwit. She was a mirror reflecting parts of himself he hadn't wanted to see. Ethan decided to change his approach. If Sophia valued influence over control, perhaps it was time to prove he could learn from her rather than challenge her. He began attending events and meetings with a quieter demeanor, observing more and dominating less. His colleagues noticed the difference, though none dared to question it aloud. One afternoon, he received an unexpected call from Sophia. "Mr. Bradford," she began, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "I understand you've been attending some of the same industry events as me?" Ethan smirked. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all," she replied smoothly. "But I have a proposition for you." There's an opening at one of my restaurants tomorrow night, an exclusive tasting event. I think you'd find it enlightening." Ethan hesitated, sensing there was more to the invitation than she let on. "I'll be there." "Good," Sophia said. "And, Mr. Bradford? Come with an open mind." The tasting event was held at Maison Étoile, one of Sophia's most prestigious locations. The dining room was a masterpiece of understated elegance, with soft lighting and minimalist decor that allowed the food to take center stage. As Ethan entered, he was greeted by a host who escorted him to a private room. Sophia was already there, seated at the head of a long table set for two. She looked poised as ever, her dark hair swept into a low bun, her dress simple yet impeccable. "Punctual," she remarked as Ethan took his seat. "I wasn't sure if you'd show." "I don't miss opportunities," he replied, his tone measured. Sophia smiled faintly. "Good. Because tonight isn't just about the food." As the courses began to arrive, Sophia guided the conversation with precision, steering it away from pleasantries and toward deeper topics. She spoke of the challenges she had faced building her empire, the sacrifices she had made, and the moments of doubt that had nearly derailed her. For the first time, Ethan glimpsed a vulnerability beneath her composed exterior, one that made her success all the more impressive. When the final course was served, a delicate soufflé that seemed to defy gravity, Sophia leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady on Ethan. "Tell me, Mr. Bradford," she said, her tone soft but firm, "why do you do what you do?" Ethan frowned, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "Your success," Sophia clarified. "Your wealth, your power. What's it all for?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. It was a question he had never truly asked himself. For years, his ambition had been fueled by a need to prove himself, to dominate every arena he entered. But now, sitting across from Sophia, he realized how hollow that ambition had become. "I suppose I've always thought of it as winning," he admitted finally. "Being the best. Proving I could." Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And has it made you happy?" Ethan stared at her, the weight of her question settling over him. He had spent his life chasing victories, yet here he was, unsure of what those victories had truly brought him. "No," he said quietly, "not in the way I thought it would." Sophia leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "Then maybe it's time to redefine what success means to you." The conversation lingered in Ethan's mind long after the event ended. As he returned to his penthouse, the city lights glittering outside his window, he felt a sense of unease he hadn't experienced in years. Sophia Richards had done something no one else had. She had made him question himself, but along with the discomfort came a flicker of determination. For the first time, Ethan didn't want to win against Sophia. He wanted to earn her respect. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He reached out to the head of one of his subsidiaries, instructing them to review policies that had long been criticized for their ruthlessness. He canceled a meeting with a potential client whose business practices clashed with his evolving values. And, most importantly, he drafted a letter of apology to a small company his firm had nearly destroyed years ago. It was a start, small steps toward a version of himself he wasn't sure he fully understood yet. Meanwhile, Sophia observed Ethan's actions from afar. She heard whispers of his sudden changes, the deals he was walking away from, and the quiet gestures of amends he was making. It was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. She had seen the potential for growth in him, even if he hadn't seen it in himself. One evening, as she reviewed reports in her office, her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Dinner. My treat this time." Sophia hesitated for a moment before typing her reply. "Only if you're cooking." 2 nights later, Ethan stood in his penthouse kitchen, chopping vegetables with a focus he usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. He had invited Sophia over, determined to show her that he wasn't just willing to change, he was committed to it. When Sophia arrived, she was greeted by the scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. She raised an eyebrow as she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the elegantly set table and the surprisingly homey atmosphere. "Impressive," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I didn't think you'd actually cook." Ethan smirked. "I told you I don't miss opportunities." As they shared the meal, their conversation flowed easily, the tension that had defined their earlier interactions replaced by something warmer. They spoke not as adversaries, but as equals, two people who had challenged each other and, in the process, found something unexpected. By the time the evening ended, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Sophia wasn't just someone he respected. She was someone he wanted to build something with, not just in business, but in life. As Sophia left, she paused at the door, turning to face him. "You've come a long way, Ethan, but don't stop here. Change isn't a destination. It's a journey." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I won't." And as the door closed behind her, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Sophia Richards hadn't just changed the way he saw her. She had changed the way he saw himself. Ethan Bradford sat in his penthouse, staring out over the Manhattan skyline. The view was the same as it had always been. Towering buildings, shimmering lights, the city that never slept. But something about it felt different tonight. For years, this view had symbolized his success, his dominance in a world where only the strongest thrived. Now, it seemed to challenge him, reflecting the questions Sophia Richards had stirred within him. He had spent weeks reevaluating his choices, his priorities, and his definition of success. Conversations with Sophia lingered in his mind, her words replaying like a song he couldn't forget. She had pushed him to look deeper, not just at her, but at himself. And as much as he hated to admit it, she had been right. It was during a meeting with his executive team that Ethan decided to take a bold step. The discussion revolved around an acquisition, a smaller company struggling under financial pressure. In the past, Ethan would have seized the opportunity without hesitation, viewing it as another victory in his portfolio. But this time, he hesitated. "What's the impact on their employees?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically measured. The room fell silent. One of his executives cleared his throat. "Well, it's significant. Layoffs would likely be necessary to streamline operations." Ethan frowned, his gaze drifting to the reports spread across the table. He thought of the countless lives affected by his past decisions, the small businesses he had crushed in his pursuit of profit. And he thought of Sophia's challenge, to redefine what success meant to him. "We're not moving forward," he said finally, his voice firm. The room erupted in murmurs of surprise, but Ethan didn't waver. He had built his empire on control and domination, but perhaps it was time to rebuild it on something more meaningful. Sophia heard about the decision through her network. It wasn't unusual for her to keep tabs on Ethan. His actions often had ripple effects in industries she navigated. But this time, the news surprised her. The Ethan Bradford she had met months ago wouldn't have hesitated to close the deal. This was something new. When she received an invitation to dinner at Ethan's penthouse a few days later, she hesitated. Their dynamic had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face what that might mean. But curiosity won out, and she accepted. The evening was understated, a reflection of the changes Ethan was undergoing. The dining table, once a place for lavish displays of wealth, was simply set with candles and a few well-chosen dishes. Sophia noted the effort as she took her seat, her gaze meeting Ethan's. "Impressive," she said, her tone light. "I wasn't sure you had this in you." Ethan smiled faintly, pouring them each a glass of wine. "I've been learning a lot lately." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Learning or unlearning?" "Both," he admitted. "I used to think success was about winning, about being the smartest person in the room. But now, I'm starting to see it differently." Sophia leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "And what brought about this epiphany?" "You did," Ethan said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Sophia didn't respond, her gaze searching his face. "I didn't think you were listening," she said finally. "I wasn't," Ethan admitted with a small laugh. "Not at first. But you have a way of getting through to people, even when they don't want to hear it." Sophia smiled faintly, her guard lowering just a fraction. "And now that you've heard it, what are you going to do?" Ethan's expression grew serious. "I'm going to keep listening, and I'm going to do better. Not because I want your approval, but because I've realized I need to be better. For myself." Sophia nodded slowly, her respect for him deepening in ways she hadn't expected. She had challenged him, but he had done the hard work of rising to that challenge. It was rare to see someone like Ethan Bradford change, and rarer still for that change to feel genuine. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics: travel, favorite books, memories of childhood. For the first time, they spoke not as adversaries, but as two people learning to understand each other. The tension that had defined their interactions was replaced by something warmer, something unspoken but undeniable. When Sophia rose to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. She paused, turning to face him. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said, her tone soft but firm. "But don't forget, change isn't about a single moment. It's about every choice you make moving forward." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I know, and I'm ready." Sophia smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "Good." As the door closed behind her, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, his success didn't feel hollow. It felt earned. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to make changes, both in his business and in his life. He revisited old decisions, offering amends where he could, and redefined his company's goals to prioritize sustainability and ethical practices. It wasn't easy, and he knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Sophia, meanwhile, observed his progress from afar. She hadn't expected Ethan to rise to the challenge she had set, but he had proven her wrong in the best possible way. And as much as she valued her independence, she couldn't deny the growing connection between them. A connection that felt less like competition and more like partnership. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message. "Thank you for everything." Sophia smiled, her heart warmed by the simplicity of his words. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that Ethan Bradford wasn't just a man she had challenged. He was a man who could meet her on equal footing, and perhaps a man she could truly trust. The quiet hum of the city filled the air as Ethan Bradford stood on the balcony of his penthouse, a glass of bourbon in hand. For the first time in years, the view below wasn't just a symbol of his dominance. It was a reminder of the world he had overlooked. The bustling streets, the people moving through their lives with quiet purpose, all carried stories he had never cared to understand until now. At the center of this newfound perspective was Sophia Richards. She had been an unexpected force, reshaping the way he saw not only the world but himself. She was proof that power didn't have to be loud, that influence could be subtle, and that respect was earned, not demanded. Sophia, meanwhile, was closing up La Belle Maison for the evening. The restaurant was quiet now, the last of the staff finishing their tasks as the soft glow of the chandeliers bathed the space in warmth. She walked through the dining room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. It had been another successful evening, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't deny that Ethan Bradford had surprised her. When they first met, he had been everything she detested: arrogant, dismissive, and blind to the humanity in others. But he had changed, and not in a superficial way. His actions spoke louder than any words could, and she found herself wondering if she had underestimated him as much as he had initially underestimated her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. "Are you free for a walk?" Sophia hesitated for a moment before typing her reply. "Give me 15 minutes. They met on a quiet stretch of the High Line, the city lights casting a soft glow over the elevated park. Ethan was already waiting when Sophia arrived, his hands in his pockets as he leaned against the railing. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression softening as their eyes met. "Didn't think you'd say yes," he admitted with a small smile. Sophia shrugged, her lips twitching into a faint smile of her own. "I was curious." They began walking, the sound of their footsteps blending with the distant hum of the city. For a while, neither spoke, the silence between them comfortable yet charged with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I owe you more than an apology, Sophia." She glanced at him, her expression curious. "For what?" "For underestimating you," he said simply. "For assuming I knew who you were without ever bothering to really see you. And for letting my arrogance get in the way of understanding the truth." Sophia stopped, turning to face him fully. Her gaze was steady, her tone even. "And what is the truth, Ethan?" "The truth," he said, his voice soft but firm, "is that you've taught me more in a few months than I've learned in years. About myself, about what it means to lead, about what really matters." Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, her lips curved into a genuine smile. "It seems I underestimated you too." Ethan's brow furrowed. "How so?" "I didn't think you'd change," she admitted. "Not really, but you have. And that's not something I see often." They resumed walking, their pace unhurried. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, memories from their childhoods, the lessons they had learned along the way. For the first time, there was no tension between them, no need for pretense or posturing. They spoke as equals, their mutual respect forming the foundation of something neither had expected. By the time they reached the end of the High Line, the city had grown quieter, the night deepening. Sophia paused, her gaze drifting to the skyline. "You know," she said softly, "when I first started this journey, I told myself I'd never let anyone distract me from my goals. And now?" Ethan asked, his voice equally soft. Sophia turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Now, I'm realizing that some distractions aren't distractions at all. They're opportunities." Ethan smiled, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in years. "So, what happens next?" Sophia's smile widened, a glimmer of mischief in her eyes. "That depends on you, Mr. Bradford." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're always one step ahead, aren't you?" "Always," she replied, her tone light but certain. They stood there for a moment longer, the city stretching out before them, a world of possibilities waiting to be explored. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he wasn't chasing something. Instead, he was building something. Something real, something meaningful. As they walked away together, the past felt like a distant echo, overshadowed by the promise of what lay ahead. And for Ethan and Sophia, that promise was enough.